Well, hello. This is Fake Zappa. I am a multimedia artist and a mental health activist. I speak out about my own story about how I'm treated as an artist and with the stigma of not only mental illness but being on disability, which makes it very interesting. And I like to talk about how the mentally ill are portrayed in the media. And I talked some about the sort of lovable mentally ill folks, and we've seen that in the media for decades. And of course, the criminalized crazy. And I typically seem to fall into the category of sort of being a big, loud guy, of being sort of the one that people are scared of, even in the mental health community. But I've noticed it's run by a lot of folks that are more of the passive aggressive type, especially the men. And so it's interesting, though, when men are portrayed as crazy, as being sort of the assertive type, that there's a lot of stigma with that. And it's funny, though, also being a gay man, although I'm closeted, shh, don't tell anybody, is that I have something to compare being an outcast because of being gay in certain circumstances and knowing that, okay, that's bigotry. And then being an outcast as being outspoken about living with mental disabilities. And like, that's also bigotry. It's just weird when it happens with very educated people that I think should know better. So when it comes to the educated world, though, it's interesting, though, how mentally ill people are considered valuable when they can use them. And I think Sheldon Cooper is a great example of somebody that he's working on string theory and all this kind of stuff. Of course, we all know it's fictional, but still, though, in real life, though, those things do happen, especially if there's a lot of privileges behind that person, if they've been recognized when they were younger, if they have an educational background and stuff like that. And then I like to compare my own life with that, as being kind of a hyper gifted kid, not intellectually, not at all, not academic, not reading books and anything like that, but being hyper creative and being really glad for that as well. So I can relate to some things about that life. And I think there's some things that are realistic about characters like Sheldon Cooper, and of course things that are unrealistic. And today I want to talk a lot about one of my favorite characters in the whole Big Bang Theory universe, which is Dr. John Sturges. And we knew that actor from The Princess Bride, and he played a villain. In fact, he was kind of a lovable villain, but he was definitely the lovable senior crazy guy in this one here who was recognized. And, lovable elderly old men who, never get married and don't drive a car and very kid-like and stuff like that. And I was really impressed, though, in several episodes ago when he had a nervous breakdown and he came out to Connie, Mima, as living with a mental illness. And so here's what's interesting about Sheldon Cooper character is that he was rarely like symptomatic. Like when he went on his big train trip, when there's changes that'll trigger the character of Sheldon Cooper, you will notice that he will be symptomatic or he will be episodic. Something I'm impressed about with the Dr. John Sturges character is not only the reality about romantic relationships for somebody like him, but the fact that he had delusional disorders, like a form of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or something like that, that would be triggered sometimes by really nothing. It's just sometimes mental illness doesn't have to be triggered. Sometimes it's cyclical. Sometimes it's quite random. And I think if people portray that in the media, which they do sometimes, I think that's really good. Most of the time, a mental health episode or a crisis is a lot of times what people are calling it, is typically triggered by something. And I think in this case with Dr. John Sturges, it could have been triggered with the fact that he has never been able to maintain a long-term relationship and he's pretty much given up on it. And I think that this is what happens with guys that I have dated in the past who live with mental health issues, especially when there are different forms of denial of those, is that they just simply can't meet the level of intimacy that I need. which is typical with most guys, anyways. And so, um, I think that when Connie was getting to a certain level of intimacy with Dr. John, I think that might have triggered, and that could be a pretty realistic way of portraying an episodic type mental illness, because sometimes delusional stuff, like especially like Dr. John Nash is a great example. I just went through the whole book. Now, audiobook, mind you, I don't think I could sit there and read his book. There was a lot of mathematical jargon in it. But John Nash, also a homo, was an interesting situation because he had very volatile social skills. And if he wasn't recognized in college age, and a lot of times this stuff will show itself. Like, for instance, like a couple of folks that I think of in the 60s, Syd Barrett, and of course Brian Wilson. One survived, one didn't. And you guys, guys like Nick Drake and a lot of people that didn't survive, is that their illness didn't develop until about their mid-20s, about college age. Well, with John Nash, though, he came to college, he was already noticeably mentally ill. It's just that his genius stuff was recognized, and unfortunately, even though a lot of people think this is a good thing, is that if a mentally ill person is so volatile, antisocial, nobody wants to be around them, so nobody wants to help them, unless they're valuable, unless, oh, this guy's a genius, or this guy's an artist, or whatever, therefore he's valuable, therefore we're going to overlook his social issues. And I hate that. I hate that mentality, because what about all the people that either have something to contribute that aren't recognized, or those that don't really have anything significant to contribute to science or arts or entertainment or really anything like that too? Maybe there's somebody who's mentally ill and they're not even a good fuck, and they just are marginalized and they're stuck in an institution or whatever. And, those are the people I think that we need to make shows about. I think it'd be great to have a show about somebody who is completely, quote, useless. And I hate that, because people shouldn't be, this person's useful, this person's not. Everybody, I think, should be valuable. But the reality is, in this world, I think people do have values. And especially when somebody has social issues or socially undeveloped, like for me, though, my social issues is that I don't pick up on subtleties when it comes to being around educated people, which is why being around the LGBTQ community, urban progressive West Coast culture, especially the artsy-fartsy world, and they're all very subtle, they're all very indirect, unless, of course, you're in New York City or something like that, and then it's kind of the opposite. But still, it is very difficult for me to pick up on subtleties when something is going on and somebody says something and I take it literally, and everybody in the room knows what's going on and I don't, and everybody thinks I'm being rude, everybody thinks I'm being stupid, and here's the thing is that what's frustrating, and this is something you'll see on Young Sheldon and The Big Bang Theory a lot, is you'll see young Sheldon or old Sheldon, and he's just completely clueless to something that's obvious to everybody around him. And having a sister, I think, is great, because I've got a sister, and we were very close in age. We were only a grade apart. And she was so much like the Cooper little girl, of just being this 10-year-old, 11-year-old socialite that is giving advice to adults. Adults are confiding in this little kid, and she's got the answers to their relationships and stuff like that. And I just love that. In fact, the whole family, I think, is great. Of course, I don't know what it is, but the older Lance Barber gets, he gets so much more sexier and sexier, and I don't care if he stuffs his pants or he doesn't. He probably doesn't. I just like to think that he doesn't. But man, he's so fucking sexy. And even when he was the bully on The Big Bang Theory, I thought he was still sexy when he was the drunk bully that made that horrible reappearance in their life. But here's the thing about Something I find interesting, though, the differences that they're making between Dr. John Sturgis, who's like this role model for young Sheldon, to say, hey, you could be fucked up and crazy and people hating you and making fun of you. You could still be successful and do what you love to do. And I think that's what's great about that show, is that he finally has that role model. And who's just as clueless about social stuff. And it's so funny because you got someone like the character of Mima, Connie, who is socially volatile and at the same time very socially skilled. It's just that she just doesn't give a fuck, which I think is really funny, having a daughter who is a hyper conservative, which is actually pretty common, I think, though, because anyways, that just kind of reminds me of my years as a practicing fundamentalist born again Christian. And so when I see born again Christians portrayed in the media, they're always exaggerated. And Mary Cooper is, I think, one of the best examples of a church lady that shows how ignorant and fucked up that she is as a character, and how loving and kind and warm and dedicated and sacrificial. That's the thing about fundamentalists, is that once you get to know a lot of these people and you get to meet a lot of fundies, you will find that their sacrificial behaviors of expressing love is higher than most people that I've encountered in my life. And I think the media should portray that. And I think that they do that justice. Another thing, too, is that I've worked with a lot of pastors, working with youth and working with music when I was younger. And that pastor who is so obviously insecure, except for when he's in the pulpit, and sometimes even in the pulpit, is that something I learned in Bible school, too, is that pastors are just really insecure guys. And so that's another thing they portray. But Sturgis, I think, is just a gem, especially when it comes to his relationship with Connie, because she just came into his life and he wasn't on dating services. He wasn't looking for anybody. And she's his total opposite. And he falls for her. And then, and I'm sure if you're watching this, you've seen this episode, so sorry if there's a spoiler here too, is that he breaks it off simply because, and this breaks my heart, because I was experiencing this same thing last year, where I had to break off of a relationship that had directly to do with mental illness. And if I look at my failed relationships, there is almost always a mental health component involved, if not every single time. If there wasn't any mental health issues, I would have been able to survive in any of those relationships. And so some of that just has to do with me being disabled and vulnerable, which is something I wish somebody would acknowledge in my life. I think if they were to show the real Sheldon Cooper in his life, they would have, instead of showing somebody like Amy coming into his life, they would have showed somebody who would take advantage of Sheldon. But the thing about Sheldon as an adult, which is very rare for somebody with that kind of social development issues, is the fact that he has friends that tolerate him. And I think that is where we're kind of getting into fantasy, unfortunately. I hate to say that. And then when that's the case, that adult Sheldon, he ends up getting involved in, for instance, who was that North Korean spy? Joyce Kim, I think. She ends up seducing, not Waller's, I can't remember. Boy, I haven't seen that show for a long time, of course. Leonard Hofstadter, she seduces him and not Sheldon. And I think there are people that have tried to take advantage of Sheldon, and he was either too clueless or his friends protected him. And if I look back on my life, my God, I would love to see if anybody were to say, hey, this person is taking advantage of your illness and your time and your resources as a disabled guy, and you need to call that off, or you need to look into that. That would be awesome. But when it came to John and Connie and young Sheldon, I think that was a great example of opposites attract and true love. and an opportunity for Dr. Sturgis to practice some levels of intimacy, and with a character who really didn't want a lot of intimacy anyway. She doesn't want to get married. She didn't want to marry that fucking coach. And I think that's a great example, too, of two types of crazy. I mean, the coach was so crazy in his need for power and to get power and to overpower everything and to be in charge and all that. That's a form of crazy. And I think it's interesting that Connie went for that, which is very typical for a lot of people that go from a sincere crazy person to an insincere crazy person who doesn't admit that they're doing something delusional, and doing things in order to get power is a form of delusion. It's a form of being crazy. And I think that the coach was just another example of Connie going for a crazy guy. And I think that one of the reasons why Connie loved Dr. Sturgis is that she just adored her grandson that drove her fucking crazy. But still, though, I think that's also kind of realistic, too, is that at an old age, she just decided, I'm going to go for the cute, lovable guy because they're the only guys that can handle my blunt personality unless I'm with an abuser. So this is what I related to when it came to Dr. Sturgis, and this broke my heart. I was very moved by this when he broke it off by saying that him and his illness, that he doesn't want to have that hurt her, he doesn't want to bring her down and all this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I've done that before too. Not literally in that way, but there has been sacrifices that I've had to make when it comes to relationships because of my illness. And most recently, it's just, I have a heartbreaking story just about this as well. And here's the thing about me being on disability is that it's sad, though. The reality, this is the reality, is that high functioning people, socially functioning people, and resourceful people don't go out seeking a relationship with a disabled person. And that's very rare. I think there are some people that are benevolent, though. It's just that when you get close enough to a relationship where you have an able body with a disabled person or something similar to that, after a while you find that the able-bodied person, you really start questioning what their motives are. Why do you really want to be with this person? There are disabled people that are sometimes very resourceful. And that's something that needs to be addressed a lot too, and doesn't really get talked about very much as well. And I've seen that happen in my own life and the lives of others. So here's something else that happens too, is that there are able-bodied people that go for disabled people for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes because they want somebody who, and I hate to say this though, if everybody had and I think that people do have a value, like a price tag on their forehead. And so if a woman's going to go for a guy who's this, somebody like the coach, who's very powerful and, he's, a business owner and a leader and all this kind of stuff. He knows how to socialize and all this kind of stuff too, is that he's a catch. But there's a catch with the catch. And the catch is that somebody who is that, quote, valuable is going to view a lot of people as being disposable. And I've been viewed as disposable in my career as an artist after I got on disability, because I'm this guy that, okay, I can be used, and then when it comes to having a higher functioning person, well, let's dispose of the disabled guy because this other person's available and they have the social skills and they have whatever and they make us look good and stuff like that. You wouldn't believe how much that happens in educated and affirming and tolerant and diversity type circles and stuff like that too. It's one of our dirty little secrets that we have. So a lot of times what happens in relationships with an able body or an able-minded person often, and somebody who's disabled, in this case a mentally disabled person, is that the higher functioning will see themselves as, hey, if I date somebody who's out of my league, under my league, so to speak, then they won't see me as disposable. They're going to see me as a keeper, and they're going to try to do things to hold on to that relationship. And that sounds dysfunctional, although you'll find that's very common. It's in business relationships and friends, as well as stuff like romantic relationships. In fact, I was just in a business relationship here lately that reminded me of a lot of my romantic relationships, is that I was seen as disposable and treated that way. Once I was like, there was this quote in the movie Clue. If you ever see the movie Clue, came out when I was in middle school or something. And I love this thing. I think it was Mrs. White. She goes, "Men are like Kleenex, soft, strong, and disposable." Because it's a thing. Once you're done with that thing, you throw it away or you get rid of it or something like that. And so what happens is that unconsciously, when people see folks as having a value, a price tag as far as how valuable they are and how disposable they are, they get treated that way. And disposable people are often more of the dysfunctional type folks, like a disabled person. And when it comes to the mentally disabled, we've got another stigma, which is something I call invisible disabilities, because the first several episodes that we saw Dr. John Sturgis is that he was just kind of like the typical professor and the typical math, science, geek genius who excels at a lot of things and doesn't pay so much attention to getting a lot of social skills. And it wasn't totally revealed that he had a debilitating mental disorder until he's up on the roof and he's like, freaking her out, when Connie's there, because she thinks he's going to jump off or something like that. She didn't know what was going on because he was delusional. So that's one of the tough things, too, about being mentally disabled, is that I find out that I spent the first several years on disability not telling people. And I had a certain result that typically happened. So I decided, maybe if I want to change this sad result of being disposable, maybe I'll just be more forward and more upfront with somebody. And not only that, though, not only ask for equality, but ask for accommodations as well, just to see what happens. Not asking for like a handout, not asking for charity. It's just like, hey, I just want you to be aware that when I'm symptomatic, this might happen, and this will explain some of my behavior. It doesn't excuse everything I do, because I can also be an asshole and I can be egocentric. I just want you to recognize and talk to me and communicate with me that when I'm symptomatic, when I'm doing something, we need to work through it, because I'm different than everybody. We need to handle this differently and blah, 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 and all that stuff. And I thought that was going to work. And you would think that was going to work, if you're joining a band or if you're in any kind of situation or any kind of relationship like that. Well, it actually backfired, and it still does. And you know what? I still open my big fucking mouth because I don't care, because that's why I've called myself an activist. It's a form of life activism. So, for instance, if I'm dating somebody, even if it's a fucking hookup or something like that, I'm on disability, these are some of my issues, and most of the time I find out that most people have suffered from acute mental disorders, or they can relate because they've experienced grief in their life or a situational type depression or something like that. Or you get guys that, this is most of the time, because I've noticed this, that closeted gay men are some of the worst homophobic, abusive people that I've come across. And then we know that through history. If you watch them, I think there's a movie called Outrage, where it's talking about, these Congress guys and these politicians that are having these anti-gay voting records, and then they're caught in cruising spots, and they're bending over for these guys, and, having anonymous gay sex and all this kind of stuff. Well, here's the thing, is that I keep relating my gay issues and the bigotry and all this stuff that I've experienced with that as being mentally disabled, which is one of the reasons why I have so much respect for guys like Jim Parsons, and him also being involved in a show called Special with a guy named O'Connor, I think Ryan O'Connor. Anyways, that was another show I did another YouTube video about as well. So it's it's great that somebody like Jim Parsons, who's openly gay and supports a lot of mental health stuff, and who's played gay roles and mentally ill roles, and he's done an awesome job. And now he's in a producer role. He's even played a producer and stuff like that too. So here's the thing: is I look at my gay bigotry, I look at my disabled bigotry, and I've noticed some very similar and some very sad things about that. And one of the worst things that has happened to me from a lot of people over the years, especially men, are mental health closet cases. And I noticed that there's the same thing with, if there's a closeted gay man and he's in denial, he's obviously going to have this sort of pathological externalization, whatever you call it, of all of his internal denial and struggles and all that bullshit. And he's going to spew that on somebody who is typically an openly gay person, or typically not only somebody who's openly gay, but a target, somebody who's alone. And this is a big thing, is that, when there's a child, or when there's a woman, or when there's an elderly person or something like that who are alone, I think it's pretty obvious that they need protection, they need support, they need somebody to be their voice, they need advocacy and stuff like that, especially when they're visibly disabled. You got some person in a wheelchair that's being beat up. It's a whole different thing than somebody who is, in a street fight and they're not in a wheelchair. It's just a whole different thing. It's just with invisible disabilities, a lot of us aren't seen as vulnerable. And so that's something I would really hope they would recognize in the media when it comes to these non-popular, these non-important, non-gifted, non-talented, mentally disabled people who don't look mentally disabled. Those are some of the biggest targets for abuse that I have noticed when I get to talking to people in the mental health community and stuff like that. Surprisingly, men are often victimized. There's one guy that I know, and I'm going to wrap it up here in a little bit, is that, anyways, he had this girlfriend who was a con artist, and she was a serial abuser and took advantage. He didn't have a lot of money, but the little that he had, she found a way to take it, and then she would win in court. She was amazing because here's the guy who's on his own. He's got no friends, and he's barely surviving. And here's this con artist that comes into his life, and she takes his car and all this other stuff and just does these horrible things. And he's just doesn't know how to defend himself, and it was really a sad situation, and I can relate to that in some ways as well. It's not to say that, the women are the bad guys, no, because usually it's the opposite, which is why I think they typically take those sides, especially in certain areas, is that it's typically the women that are victimized, especially when you have a woman that's on her own, and that traumatizes her, which leads to a lot of mental health type symptoms, which needs to have more protection. So yes, women need to be protected. At the same time, we also need to be aware that men need to be protected. And if they're not popular and privileged and lucky, then to be recognized at a young age for their gifts and talents and stuff like that, mentally ill people need to be treated as if they have something to contribute, because I think if we're to say that everybody's valuable, we need to treat everybody as valuable. And so when it comes to Dr. John Sturgis, yes, it's realistic in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's not. There's a lot of geniuses that do end up not getting recognized, and they end up disappearing into self-harm and institutionalized, and we don't know about those stories.